Welcome back to Dog Shit Tentpole Content. Now, we're going to talk about some streaming Marvel IP, some streaming Marvel IP that exists solely to keep the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the public consciousness until the next theatrical release. So I'm going to help them out with that. Now, She-Hulk sucks, and that's a pretty big problem for me, because obviously the optics of saying that are terrible. I'm going to say some stuff about the economics of making a Marvel product, and I was really hoping that She-Hulk would be good, it'd offer a nice counterpoint, but it turns out, no, it's dog shit, so it makes this video a lot trickier than it needs to be to do. So let's start with a bit of a surface level She-Hulk review, then I'll expand out massively, go on a bunch of tangents, and then I'll do a far too in-depth She-Hulk review, and then I'll coalesce all the points that I've made into ideally a single sort of thread, and then I'll do a little outro bit at the very end. And that's basically how my videos are structured.
Critics are calling She-Hulk an absolute must-see.
Now, She-Hulk was pitched as being Marvel's first straight-up sitcom. Procedural sitcom that's sort of a humorous deconstruction of the MCU, and for about the first 10 seconds that is what it looks like. Then she looks into camera, says psych, and it's middling Marvel fare from then on. It's more formulaic than normal, it's less humorous than normal, and does less deconstruction than normal. But it does follow that formula, and that formula works for a lot of people. But for the first episode, it's just sort of a perfunctory origin story that seems like we're past doing now, but I guess not. Very sort of straightforward, unsubtle writing by the book with the aesthetics of some messaging on top. But that's kind of it. I don't know if this was intended to be the first episode, if this origin story always existed, because it does genuinely feel like the only time she does the fourth wall break, it's literally just used to smooth over narrative. She's like, oh, we're gonna do a scene transition now to a pickup or whatever. I suspect the very first fourth wall break in this show is literally to smooth over a late stage script change. So that's kind of what it is. It's just a bit of a messy show, a pretty weak Marvel outing in my opinion, but it does sort of have that flavor that the rest of them have, so if that's a flavor you're super into, you know, you get more of it. Now, insanely, the big thing about She-Hulk is that it's a woman superhero show, which is great, obviously, but it's not like that's really a feat now, you know? The year is 2022. And yet it is pitched as being one. I think it's just that Marvel has had a terrible history of representation.
It breaks new ground.
Your ass looks crazy right
now. In the early days of the MCU, under Ike Perlmutter, he was like, you know, nothing but white men, which was a bad look, even at the time. Once he got shifted aside, they were like, you know, we can do some diversity of representation occasionally, but you know, only if we like cook the book, because obviously it's good for them, good for their brand, but it would be bad for them to have a box office flop. There is the unfortunate fact that box office returns are still better for male-led action blockbusters, and the problem with that is it's a self-fulfilling thing, right? They only make male-led action blockbusters because that's what gets the returns, and so people want to see what they know, and it feeds itself. So even though, even at that stage, it was sort of like embarrassingly little what they were doing, any step in that direction helps future steps. Now we have streaming, which is a black hole where they need to dump $2 billion every quarter, and it's just about brand image. They don't make any returns on it. So it's a great place to do your representation. You don't get the negative stuff of releasing a flop, and you get to do the representation, good for the brand. But it's obviously quite sort of mercenary. It doesn't help society as a whole as much as, you know, taking gambles, doing the theatrical releases, pushing the culture forward. The nice thing is that streaming lets them do stuff that they wouldn't be doing theatrically. The flip side of that is it's kind of eating away at what they are doing theatrically, and where those theatrical releases were trending to a wider range of more diverse, equal options, now they can sort of go in the other direction. And rather than people watching and talking about the show She-Hulk, the main discussion is the sort of meta fight between women and incels, which is a little strange. As a streaming show, the content and quality of the show itself doesn't really matter. It's mostly about just sort of encouraging discourse, right? Sort of where TV writers would aim for the water cooler moment, now the goal is to create meme-worthy, post-worthy, discourse-worthy moments. And the viewership of the show itself genuinely doesn't matter. The main goal is to keep the Marvel IP in the consciousness. A sub-goal would be to make Disney Plus subscribers think that they're getting value and not unsubscribe from Disney Plus. But I think the stage was set for there to be discourse about She-Hulk long before this first episode came out.
Bruh!
The first sort of controversy around She-Hulk was the quality of the visual effects in the trailer. There was a lot of talk about why that was. Was it the texturing, the modeling? Was it the H.264 compression looks worse than the theaters? Is the character design just too close to human? But I can tell you why it looks worse. Money. The Disney Plus shows all have about half the budget of the theatrical releases, and that budget has to be stretched over 2 to 3 times the runtime. So they had less money to spend, so they spent less money, so it looks worse. You do hear this argument sort of euphemistically framed as being time. They didn't give the visual effects artists enough time, which, you know, they could have released this whenever they wanted. It's not literally about the time frame, it's that time is a labor cost, and that's money. They had a lower... Do you understand what I'm... So anyway, at the same time as this, does She-Hulk look worse stuff, there were a few articles, a bit of talk about working conditions in the visual effects industry, Marvel having particularly unreasonable demands of their visual effects artists, talk of unionization, and studios and artists who were refusing to work with Marvel. There was also the reviews. Before release, you had like 50 one-star reviews on IMDb before anyone had seen this sort of review bombing thing. But it is weird that, you know, you look into it and it's, what, this is about 50 reviews. On the flip side of that, you have Disney very carefully selecting what critics they send screeners to. I saw one critic was like, she hadn't reviewed Marvel positively since Jessica Jones, and they'd stopped sending her screeners, but they sent her one for this, and she was like, it seemed to her that she was handpicked to review this because there was a good chance that she would review it positively. And all this gives us that classic dynamic that we have for every second media release, where the critic rating is like 100% and then the, you know, audience rating is 1%. So there's sort of this battle between the two sides, but both of those sides are entirely fabricated. Of course, once it comes out, now that She-Hulk's out, those things normalize. The critic score's gone down by 10%, the audience score is bumped back up. So there was a brief window of time where that was a talking point, but it never really, nothing happened. And then in the marketing materials, whether intentional or not, it does seem to push a sort of irony watch angle, which is kind of popular right now. You have the meme-worthy shots, Tinder campaign, an anti-homeless She-Hulk bench, weird decisions, sort of embarrassing decisions, stuff that doesn't really make sense to actually sell your product, but it is stuff that gets the people going. Not that it's all an elaborate plot and that people acted according to the Marvel PR team's schemes, but just their focus is encouraging discourse, not selling a product.
Ooh, put on a Pixar movie.
Now, before I get back to talking about the actual show, there's one more thing that set the stage for She-Hulk discourse. There was a panel of the creative team at a press-only event, and there isn't, I don't have access to it, but there are plenty of transcripts available, so as far as I can make out, in order, this is what happened. So the panel gets asked about the controversy around She-Hulk's visual effects, the recent reports of visual effects artists feeling overworked by Marvel specifically. The director-producer says, in terms of the CGI being critiqued, I think that has to do with our culture's belief in its ownership of women's bodies. I think a lot of the critique comes from feeling like they're able to tear apart the CGI woman. There's a lot of talk about her body type, and we based it on Olympian athletes and not bodybuilders. But I think if we'd gone the other way, we would be facing the same critique. I think it's very hard to win when you make women's bodies. As far as I can tell, that is genuinely the initial response to that question. I'm willing to accept that there may be a transcription error. It's insane. But you can imagine this is a talking point that she went in with. It's sort of perfect PR speak, right? It reframes this labor issue as being about this culture war, the aesthetics of the show. It's crucially reframes the question to be, hey, remember, Marvel is making a show about women. Now enter Tatiana Maslany, the protagonist of this exchange. She says, I feel incredibly deferential to how talented these artists are and how quickly they have to work. Obviously, much less time than probably should be given to them in terms of like churning these things out, and I know that there's a lot of eyes on the CG and a lot of critiques, but I do think that we have to be super conscious of how the work conditions aren't always optimal. You know, it's sort of a little bit platitudinal, but there is sort of the thrust there of acknowledging the work conditions and the structural problems that cause them, right? Now, our director-producer chips back in. We stand in solidarity with what they say the truth is. With what they say the truth is. We work with them, but we're not behind the scenes on these long nights and days. If they're feeling pressure, we stand with them and we listen to them. And this is interesting, right? The words all have positive connotations, but the meaning is like, shut the fuck up, it's not a problem. There is a kind of a good point there that one of the non-economic reasons for visual effects exploitation is that they are out of sight, out of mind. If you overwork someone on set, you make people work overtime on set, you know, you have to personally deal with that, where visual effects artists are never seen or heard from. So there is a little bit of an insight into the mindset there. But it is fucking insane. Then the writer-producer chips in. This is just a massive undertaking. To have a show of this scale where the main character is CG, it's a very overwhelming and ginormous thing to take on, and it's terrible that a lot of artists feel rushed and feel that their workload is too massive. They feel rushed and they feel that their work, it's not that they are. I mean, I think everybody on this panel stands in solidarity with all workers and is very pro good working conditions. Remember, this is a producer of the show talking. If there's any link in the chain that's created the working conditions, it's these people. Again, it's very sort of dismissive, and it sort of shows that the creative team is not thinking about labor or management or the structure, the power dynamics. There's individuals and these working conditions that have just materialized from thin air. And then Tatiana Maslany chips back in and says that they're pro-union, at which point the line of questioning is cut off. So that's a pretty weird exchange. And I think it just shows the attitudes of the creative team behind this show. Why they would make this thing the way that they've made it. The one other thing that I want to bring up that shows you the attitudes of the creative team behind this show, it's not a big point that I want to hit, but I think I should mention it. I recognized one of the writers' names from, she had like a couple of big viral Twitter threads decrying the use of irony, which obviously to me, irony is the only thing I have. Please do not take that from me.
Quick-witted.
So, with all that in mind, let's take another look at She-Hulk. Let's meet She-Hulk on its terms. So, throughout the show, all the men are thinly drawn and vile. Every line said by a man in this show is like, oh, fuck off, you know? And that's contrasted with women are thinly drawn and girl boss, which I think I kind of see what it's going for. It's trying to elevate the characters to be sort of symbols to use for comedy, right? It's sort of a farcical characterization of the men and the women. And that's worked elsewhere, right? That's worked in plenty of places. It's not really a style that you see now, sort of like 10 to 20 years late to that style. And I think that goes hand in hand with just the messaging of the show. Feels sort of behind the times. This is like a 90s or Joss Whedon feminism. But I guess Marvel is just behind the times. As a show, this shouldn't have anything to prove. But it constantly feels like it does. You know, it's like, She-Hulk can be a superhero too. Yeah. Yes, women belong in the workplace. It's like, yeah, what? Yes? Like, that groundwork has kind of been laid, we can build from there, but it never does. So it just feels incredibly dated. And while it's maybe aiming for a very broad comedy, it didn't land any jokes for me. I suppose they rarely do with the Marvel things, so that's not really a fault of this. I can see that there are plenty of jokes in there. Most of the sort of punchlines are around gender dynamics, and then the characters aren't so much characters as just functional pieces of setup, which kind of just means you never care about the characters. They're all extremely one note, whether that is being like a incredibly vile sexist in the case of Every Man, or a third wave girl boss feminist in the case of Every Woman. Then everything is on the nose. There's no subtext. All exposition is delivered as flatly as exposition as possible. It has a lot to tell you about gender, but it's not something that's actually explored through the show. There's no authentic situations. You don't care about the characters. It's not trying to create a story, it's trying to tell you moral lessons, which I think cheapens it, right? As a story, it doesn't work. And then because they're just so flatly explaining their morals to you, it often ends up sort of drifting into iffy territory, you know, because the writers are fallible. They don't have all the answers. I'm fallible. I don't have all the answers, right? And I think you understand that. There's a ton of shit that I can step in here, and I'm probably stepping in a bit of it, but you know that, right? And it would be insane of me to start hammering away at you with what I think you should think. There's like a 2-minute stretch where she crashes a car, hulks out, finds a bar in the middle of nowhere, goes to the bathroom, then some girls come in, they do a makeover, then she goes outside and gets sexually harassed by men, and then she turns back into the Hulk and beats them up. You know, it's just sort of a rapid succession of tropes that we've seen before. And in the middle of that, you have this line of dialogue that's like...
You do not need him. Or her. Or them.
Which isn't inclusive, right? They wrote that. If you were going to be inclusive, you'd just say them. So what? It's a joke. And the joke there would be trans and gay people exist. So you have these like broad, dated comedic tropes, then mixed with the threat of sexual violence. But I think when the writers are ignoring power structures, they're not doing subtext, they do necessarily end up doing a lot of the surface level stuff that is a little bit off. And then we could contrast that to later on, the Hulk stops her leaving by force. It's delivered as like a whimsy action beat, but it's incredibly uncomfortable. And it's a moment that we've arrived at because the writers need to contrive situations where She-Hulk gets to clap back at men, but in doing so, they sort of uncritically present this horrible scenario. They are ignoring the subtext of this situation, and they're ignoring the power dynamics of this situation. Contrast this moment to the earlier threat of violence from men, which was explicit and the writers criticized. This is unintentional subtext, and the writers just go along with it. A situation where there is an uncomfortable power dynamic between two people is nothing to worry about. But when the aesthetics of what the person is saying is bad, that's what's bad. And then, of course, she gets this speech that is made to be shared on social media, that she can control her Hulk self because of her experience having to control her emotions being a woman, you know, for fear of it hurting her career or getting her murdered, which is a good point to make. There's a different gendered experience. It's the sort of thing you'd expect this show to go into. But, you know, in the context of the show, it's not really functional as a scene, it's functional as a point to make, and it ignores power, right? This is about the struggle of the individual. It's presented as this girl power moment where the messaging of it is sort of resigning women to their role in society. You know, if they had tried to explore these moments authentically, you could glean something from it, but everything is so surface level, it's so on the nose, just like the writer's messaging is just read straight out to you. To them, the problem here is the fundamental, unchangeable differences between men and women. The relationship itself between men and women. And it's very sort of gender essentialist, right? Men are this way, women are this way, and that is what the problem is. If you want to get knee deep in it, it's a show without intersectionality. that refuses to engage with the conditions of exploitation that would lead to these power dynamics. It's designed to be sort of in-group backpatting. If you do agree with their niche, dated worldview, it's really great to be affirmed. If you're kind of anyone else, it is alienating to some degree. I think it makes the show very backwards looking, and it feels like a backwards step.
It's the funniest MCU show to date.
Then of course, outside of the content, the She-Hulk show only exists as a woman-led streaming show. It's a sort of gamble. A fully digital character is too costly, and there is a glass ceiling, there is a pay gap for women, so a women-led streaming show is cheap. So in real life, She-Hulk is playing second fiddle to the Hulk. Imagine if they had spent the money to bring the visual effects of She-Hulk on parity with the Hulk in her own show. But no, the Marvel machine, Disney itself, is still fundamentally sexist. But Disney's marketing at large does believe in the power of irony, and they have used it to great effect to inspire bickering online. No one gives a fuck about this show. It's about the discourse around this show, sharing these incoherent screenshots and then arguing about it. And that's not helpful, and it is reductive, and it is a backward step. No one wins out of that. People who make monetized culture war content win, and Disney wins, but no one else does. Society at large loses. And if you're talking about She-Hulk and you're not receiving financial compensation for it, you've been played. So the lesson is, stop posting. I'm the only one who's allowed to post. Now, the other tentpole that I could have made content for in this time period was the Saints Row reboot. I have some thoughts on that. Dovetails quite nicely with the She-Hulk stuff, so I'll record that now and put that up on the website. I'm really happy with the Doctor Strange review that I did on the website if you're looking for more deconstruction of Marvel stuff. Otherwise, I probably have another tentpole video coming out in a fortnight, and I am cooking up a really big, dumb, stupid video. So if you're not into the tentpole stuff and you just want me to make really high effort content, don't worry, it's not too far away. Good. Thanks.